people will say, oh, Hammy, if you support a one-state solution, then you support terrorists. So I'm like, I mean, if we're going to talk about one-state solutions and terrorists, even George Habash, who was the progenitor of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, his solution was a single multi-ethnic secular democracy, right? And this was a guy who committed like multiple terrorist attacks during the 1970s, right? He was responsible for the Dawson's Field hijackings of all things. Actually, the Dawson's Field hijackings are really interesting as a piece of history. If you get a chance, chat, I would recommend people read historical accounts of people who were on the planes that were hijacked in Dawson's Field. They're super fucking interesting, right? About the conversations that these people had with the militants of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Super, super interesting. Because it turns out a lot of the people who were on the planes that were hijacked in Dawson's Field came out of that with far more sympathy for the Palestinians than when they went in. It's super, super interesting. It's too long for me to go over now. But they're really interesting reading. Really, really interesting reading. Because there's a really famous conversation between one of the hijacking victims and a PFLP militant, where they say, no one will listen to us. This is the only way that we can get out our story. No one will listen to our story if we don't do this. We have to make news by engaging in what is essentially terrorism. And this person who was stuck in the middle of the desert in Jordan, in Amman, suddenly found a voice that they had never heard before. A lot of dehumanization of terrorists, as in they are portrayed as functionally insane. Like wild animals who cannot be reasoned with under any circumstances, it's very dangerous. I think this touches the biggest disconnect that we're seeing right now in the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? Why the left and the right disagree so much on Israel-Palestine. Why the young and the old disagree so much on Israel and Palestine. Now, when the age difference is a little bit about propaganda and the information that you see and consume, the big sticking point between liberals and the left on Israel and Palestine is the gap between materialist philosophy and idealist philosophy, right? In that if you're an idealist, right, if you coming from an idealist perspective, you're looking at the difference in the competing ideas between people from the organizations that did like the terrorist attacks in the 1970s and the ideas of the state of Israel. You're looking at a differential and you go, well, the idea behind Israel was a state for Jewish people to be safe. And the idea behind the PFLP is trying to get rid of that state. This is the competing idea that they have, is trying to the competing ideologies behind these. And if you look at those things and you see one person wants a safe place for people to live and the other person wants to get rid of that, right? The kind of the natural kind of like idealist position is to come out of this supporting Israel. Or look, they're a secular democracy, well, not secular, but they're a democracy, right? Maybe an ethno state, but at least they're a democracy. They're a Western democracy. They agree with us on things like gay rights, at least now, to a certain degree or whatever it might be, right? All of these things. And you look at a terrorist and you go, well, their terrorist ideas are bad ideas because terrorism is this thing that people do. Because, as you say, they can only do it because they're wild animals. Their ideas that they've created here are bad ideas, right? And it's not wrong, right? Terrorism is a bad thing, right? I'm not coming out in support of Palestinian terrorists with this segment that I'm doing here. But when you look at this through a materialist perspective, you understand that the ideas don't create the material conditions. The material conditions create the ideas. And that's the gap. That's the gap between liberals and leftists that makes liberals support Israel and leftists support Palestine. Because we understand here on the left that groups like the PFLP, like Hamas, like the PPP, like PIJ, are the material response to the settler colonial project of Israel, right? That's why these people exist. People don't become terrorists because they're insane wild animals. It's a response to continuing material conditions and the failures of other kinds of political solutions that have been attempted up to this point because of the lack of attempt from Israel to want to create a workable solution, because they are fundamentally concerned with acquiring territory as a colonial project would do, right? I always say this, really true. People talk about like the ethnic nature of the conflict, and that's somewhat true, but really and truly it is territorial, as settler colonial projects always are. That's why there's always the right wing of the Israeli politics, and also the centrist liberal types as well, are very intent on expansion of settlements and gaining territory, the creation of greater Israel, etc., etc., because there is a material desire to be able to gain that extra territory. And the people who become radicalized against this are the ones who see the material conditions drop, who see the material amount of land they have access to be continually settled and colonized, and because they materially weep for the loss of the land and the loss of the territory and the loss of the homes and the loss of the communities that were felt by the Nakba of 1948 and the continual material dispossession that they've been through for the last 75 years of occupation, by the material levels of penury that they've been put into by continual occupation and continual blockades, continual denial of fundamental basic human rights that they should have access to. Because any liberal, right, will say, sure, the material conditions are bad, but that's no justification for becoming terrorists. And on the left will say, none of us are trying to justify it. We don't think there's justification either. What we understand is that whether or not it's justified or not, these material conditions will create the perfect breeding ground for this radicalization, right? It's the same way that we can look at the failures of the war on terror and the failures of Western intervention in those areas and the power vacuum that was created by continual Western interventionism in places like the Middle East as the perfect vacuum to be filled by terrorist groups who are radicalized by anti-Western sentiment because of the way their material conditions have been denigrated by Western interventionism, to be radicalized by these people into the idea, right, the material creations create the radicalization, not the other way around, to then fill that vacuum to fight against the West, which then creates the East-West dynamic, right? The material relationships between the East and the West is where you find it's that dialectic of the material relationship between the East and West that creates the situation that means that an ideology like ISIS, like the Taliban, like Al-Qaeda can be able to flourish. We understand radical ideology doesn't just magic itself into existence. Exactly, 100%. It's interesting you say it's about idealism, materialism. The centrist, liberal, and managerial classes are normally the ones who love data collection and evidence-based policy. But I think that, there is something to be said about technocrats looking at, data collection and results from data as a justification for their policies. And I think you're right somewhat in that. But the chicken the egg situation of ideas and of material conditions, right, is even afterwards, like, because the way the policy gets created in the first place that you then collect the data from is still a result of those material conditions, right? If you look back, like, because you can use the same thing. You can use the same thing to understand the history of British politics. Okay, so you look at the way in which older people nowadays tend to be more right-wing, right? And we mentioned this but earlier on in the stream, because they are materially were incentivized to do so by the neoliberalism gold rush, by the extra stuff that they were afforded, because neoliberalism and deregulation and the public sector sell-off generated material wealth for them, which engenders them towards ideology, right? An ideology that's successful for them materially will then create the conditions for them to be further pushed into that ideology. In the same way that millennials and Zoomers who grew up post-financial crisis, who grew up in the era of austerity, who grew up in the end of globalization and the death of global neoliberal hegemony, the material conditions radicalized them to the left. It radicalized them to socialism. It radicalized them against neoliberalism further, because the material conditions and the failures of that ideology that created those material conditions has then pushed us into an ideology that opposes that, right? That would want to create the material conditions that would then fulfill our own ideology, right? And this is why the right wing think that young people have been indoctrinated. This is why they think that young people have been indoctrinated, because they look at us with different ideas around the economy, around foreign policy, around Israel-Palestine, around social policy, around the culture war. And because they can only see things as a set of competing ideas rather than ideas that are born out of material conditions, they think that someone must have put the ideas in our heads. They think that we must have been indoctrinated into it by other people trying to force ideas upon us, and not indeed as a function of the material conditions that we were subjected to. So I call this like the ideological bell curve that they believe in, that everyone is in the center and then there are radical extremes. And when that bell curve isn't satisfied, they think that there is some kind of fifth column, some unscrupulous entity disrupting the natural order of things. And look at young people who skew way to the left. And because they have no material explanation for why that happens, the only possible explanation from then has to be malfeasance. It has to be a fifth column. It has to be people putting ideas in people's heads. Because without material analysis, without any of that material analysis, the only thing that they can think of is that conspiracy. It's why liberals and, non-materialist leftists will always stray towards conspiracy as well, because they don't understand material conditions. The centrist bell-end theory, if you will. True! Right? Exactly Valhalla video, right? This is why you get World Economic Forum conspiracies, because they can't understand the material conditions that capitalism creates, that funnels wealth upwards, that creates power in the hands of a few people, right? Because they've been sold on capitalism for so long. So, well, there must be someone disrupting the system that I think is good, right? There must be somebody creating maniacally from the background the conditions that makes my life suck, rather than just the systemic nature of capitalism making it so. Because in a world of competing ideologies, you'd think there would be this bell curve of centrism, but it doesn't exist in the material world, and that's the one we live in. And this is why liberals will fail at geopolitics, because they think they can beat bad ideas with good ideas. When what you actually have to do is you have to beat bad material conditions with good material conditions. I know it's I know it's almost trite at this point to just be a leftist on the internet and just replace every single point that gets made with the word material conditions, but this particular conflict is so material in nature. And this huge gaping chasm in the way people approach it can only be explained in this manner. What really annoys you is that the left has continuously proven correct on this stuff, but we're still called unserious. Again, because we fall into what they would term as the lunatic fringes, as far as horseshoe theory is concerned. They wouldn't even call us populists, even though we're the real populists, right? That's what's tilting. They will call leftists cranks and trots, right? And they'll call fascists populists. I'm like, no, we're the populists, right? We understand the fight between the people and the elites. It's just the people are the working class and the elites are the bourgeois and the corporations. That's what's frustrating, right? Yeah, Sarah Jessica points out in chat, liberals are all about the metaphysical. Is that literally, like, liberals will think that bad people just do things because they're evil people who want to do bad. It's such a fucking incredibly stupid and myopic way of looking at the world. Because if you don't look at the material nature of this conflict, the only possible position you can put yourself into is Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are just evil people who do the bad things because they're bad, right? They just create a legion of doom. This is why, when we watched the clip yesterday of Isaac Herzog saying, well, we're fighting Hamas, ISIS, Hitler here, because nothing else speaks to liberals other than just bad people doing the bad thing, Hamas, ISIS, Hitler, Boko Haram, Darth Vader. Like that, this is the fucking Marvel movie shit. And this is why they want you to condemn Hamas as well. Because they think that any amount of discussion and analysis would be tend towards justification. In 10 years' time, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.